Hey class, thanks for tuning in. As you can see, in this video, we'll be working on building the New York Times search application that we talked about in class. In this video, I'll be walking you through the process of building this application from scratch, going through each of the key steps that go into the application. Everything from creating the layout, researching the API, changing up the JavaScript logic to do the AJAX calls, changing up the HTML, and then dealing with the bugs that inevitably will come up whenever you work with an API. So if you're feeling comfortable, let's go ahead and get started. So as you can see, what I've done right now is I've loaded up the New York Times search application, and this will be sort of the final application for what we're building. This application takes advantage of the New York Times API to access old articles or pieces of information that are available in the New York Times archive. So we can look up any term that we'd like. So let's say I looked up Roosevelt, and we can set the number of records to retrieve. In this case, I'll retrieve 10 records, and we can set a start year and end year. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1941 to 1945, and I'm going to run search. And what you can see are an assortment of articles written around that time period, all about the subject that we're interested in. We can also then clear the results and empty it out. So you can see that I've used Twitter Bootstrap to build this, so we can sort of speed up the process and avoid having to deal with the CSS. All right, so once you have a clear idea of what we're going to build, let's go ahead and get started. All right, at this point, I've created an index.html file, and I'll be using it to create the initial HTML that will serve as our template for the overall layout. As you can see from the final product, the overall gist of this application is very similar to how I've laid out every other one of these applications in my videos. I've taken advantage of a Jumbotron at the very top to hold the title, and then I have two different panels with headings, one to hold the search parameters and then one to hold top articles. Inside of the search parameters panel, I'm using multiple form inputs. We haven't really worked with these very much in our videos, but it isn't very hard to figure out how to use them in Bootstrap. You can look at any sort of template or example online. Here's one from W3 Schools that shows you how to create the input boxes. Then we have two buttons at the bottom to search and to clear results. And then lastly, we have another Bootstrap component called Wells to hold in the content that's retrieved. That's the gray box behind. And besides that, it's kind of the application. So a lot of it's very similar to Crystal Collector or Hangman or any other application. Now, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to, again, use the same shortcuts that I've always been using to go quickly. This is a pretty long application, and I kind of want to finish it within an hour, but we'll see what happens. So New York Times search. And then we're going to go ahead and create, incorporate Bootstrap's link. And I'm going to go ahead and put that link in, Bootstrap, CSS. And I'm going to add in a container. I'm going to add in the Jumbotron. And it's going to say New York Times. And then I'm going to have a panel. And I'm going to have then a results panel. So here I'm going to put in my panel. And I'm going to call this panel search parameters. And I'm going to put inside of it nothing for right now, but I'll put in some text. And after I do that, I want to next create my second panel. It's going to be very similar to that first one. So I'll do a lot of copying and pasting. And I'm going to call this one search results. Save it, run it. And you can say this is what my application looks like right now. So pretty boring. I might keep things this way. In my other application, I use a boot swatch and various style elements, but for right now I'm just going to focus on creating a layout that's going to work. So we have that aspect done. Now let's go ahead and add in the form components. So the form, if we show these side by side, the form is going to exist Oh, looks like I forgot something very critical. Let's put this into rows. And let's move all of the content that we just created into their own columns. Okay. All right, so this is what the application looks like right now. You can continue to clean it up, style it in any other way that you like. But this gets us the gist of what we need. All right, looking good. So we might maybe also make them each their own row. Let's do that just to use best practices. All right. All right, that's the application. Next up, we're going to go ahead and create the form elements for the search parameters as well as the buttons. So I'm going to copy this content from W3 Schools to get me started, and I'm going to dump it right in here. And I'm going to kind of have to clean it up a little bit so it looks a little bit better than it does right now. Save it, run it. You can see that I have email address, password, remember me. I'm not going to use that remember me, so I'll delete it. And I'm going to also have to put in my own content. So instead of email address, I'm going to do search term, and I'm going to change label for to search, input type to text, ID to search, and then I'm going to put in, save it, rerun it. You can see search term has changed. Password, I'm going to again change the input type to text, because if you don't and you leave it as password, it's going to have these empty symbols. So put in text, and I'm going to call this one number. Let's do start year here, because we're gonna have to do something a little bit different for the other one. Start year, and we're gonna save it and change start year over here. Save it, run it. We have a start year right here, so I can put 2010. And then I'm gonna have to have this again for end year. We're gonna put in end year here. Save it. Rerun it, start year, end year, etc., etc. Button type, submit. I'm going to call it, we'll keep it submit for right now. We might just change it to search, but let's just keep it the way it is. And we also need to have a button for clearing content as well. Now, when you include something to call it a button type of submit, that'll let you hit enter on your keyboard and have it register in addition to being able to click on it. So this is looking good. The only thing we need to change at this point, looks like this little style a little bit weird. I'm gonna have to check on that and see what's going on. Let me see. Button default, button clear all, looks good, looks good. Well, we'll just have to keep it as is. It looks like the gray is a little bit odd to me. Ah, I see here. Button default. Let's move it, save it. Now we have 2 buttons that work. All right, great. So we have most of the components that we need, except for one. The only other one that we need is the number of terms, records to retrieve. And you can see that it's a drop down. This is what's called in HTML a select box. So we're going to use a select box to build this. And you can, again, use W3 Schools to find the example. Here is an example of a select box. And I'm going to copy that content. And I'm going to paste it right after that search term. And I'm going to put it into a form group. So I'll do that right here, div.formGroup. And let's do this. Tab everything over a little bit to keep things tidy. So my tabs are a little bit off because I've been copying and pasting from other people's code, but it's good enough to where I can kind of make sense of it. Okay. So save it, rerun it. Looks a little bit off to me, so let's see if we can fix this with a bootstrap select. So you can see that Bootstrap has an additional set of styles associated with select boxes. And let's find it. Here we can see it's form group, form control, is the class. So I should have copied this text. Let's do that. Copy it, paste it in place, save it. All right, so you have a select box, a search term, start year, end year. Let's change the select list to number of records to retrieve. And we're going to put in the options as 1, 5, or 10. All right, and then we're going to make the default values for each of these equal to the same thing. So we're going to call this value 5, value of 1, value equals 10. And I'm also going to include this middle one selected. So that's an additional attribute that will make the default value be 5. So we now have what looks to be a working form, and we've got all the components that we need. Next up, we're going to work on the search results. So this aspect will be handled by the JavaScript or jQuery, which is going to create content. But that said, it's still helpful at times to pre-place content just so that you know how it's going to look. So I'm going to do that right now. So instead of having this XXX, I'm going to replace it by a bootstrap well. I'm going to save it, rerun it. You can see that a gray box has appeared. And then I'm going to put in the various pieces of content. So I'm going to have a title. Maybe I should make this an H2. And then I'm going to have author, let's go with H4 for a section. And then H4 date, H4 link. Save it. So it's going to kind of look like this. And just to really understand how it's going to look like when you have multiples, I'm going to copy them and paste them in place. So now I've got 2 different examples. And we're going to obviously clear this out before we start working with the jQuery, but it's just nice to say, like, okay, layout is kind of where we need it to be. All right, so now that we've got the layout set up, let's move on to the next step, which is creating some of the JavaScripts. All right, so as we move on to the next step, I'm going to create a new file that's going to be called logic.js. And this file will handle all of the API calls, the jQuery that will create some of the content, and much of what will drive this application. Now, before I start just cracking at the JavaScript, it's going to be important for me to understand what the API that I'm working with can actually do. And in class, I'm sure many of you found that this was actually more challenging than you may have expected. So let's open up some of this stuff right now. What you can see is I've gone to the New York Times developer website. Specifically, what I'm interested in is the APIs. So I'm going to click APIs, and at the very first step, what I always recommend is read whatever it says for the getting started. So you can see that the steps associated with getting started and using this API is first you have to request an API key, then they offer you a set of documentation, but most importantly, they offer you an API tool to experiment without writing code, and then the other stuff is just some applications for examples, etc., etc. So first step, you're going to have to register for an API key. So in my case, I've already registered for it, and it just required you to put a name of an application. The website was optional. Any other information was optional. And then you have to request which of the APIs you were going to be using. So in our case, we were just going to use this Articles Search API. So we could just hit that. And let's come up with a name for our application, etc. Let's come up with NYT Search live and no website, and we're just going to request the Articles Search API. One thing you can see here that's relevant is that you can only make 10 calls per second. So in our case, we can request 10 articles per second, up to 10,000 per day. And we can kind of work around this a little bit in future after we've learned a few new concepts to bring in multiples articles, more than 10 at a time. But for right now, the limit that we're going to be requesting is 10 articles per day. I'm going to agree to their terms of service, and I'm going to register my application. So it's registered, and what you can see here is it's given me an API key. Keep this handy somewhere that you can quickly find it. So I'm just going to create something here. I'm going to call it API key.txt. I'm just going to save that API key because I'm going to need it in the application. All right, so if we go back to the overview, what you can see is that it's told us you can read the API documentation, which is fine. I saw many of you trying to do that. You'd go to the Articles Search API, you'd kind of read about how it works and construct an API URL based on it. But what I would actually recommend is hitting the API console or the API tool. And then I'm going to go to Articles Search API. I'm going to toggle all of the methods, and I'm going to create a sample URL just to see what happens when I create a query using a working application. So let's say I search for Obama, and I don't include a begin date or an end date. I just do the very simple application, and I'll even keep the sample key that they have. I'm going to try it, and it created this URL. I'm going to then go to that URL, and I'm going to take a look at how the data that was provided is going to be organized. So you can see that it has this overall object. It has inside of that a response, and it has a meta and a docs. And the docs is an array of multiple documents associated with Obama. In fact, there are 10 documents. And if I click on one of them, just look at it, I can see that I have various pieces of information, the web URL, a lead paragraph, abstract, some images, the headline, when it was published, who this is by actually. So this is an article that Barack Obama wrote himself, etc., etc. And we're going to use all of the information in this JSON in our application. Now, another thing that I would also recommend is, in this case, we use the sample key, but let's go ahead and also test to make sure that our API key is working as well. So I'm going to copy that API key, paste it in here, and then I'm going to run this like so. And it may or may not work because of some of the, it worked perfectly. So again, we know our API key works. We know that we're able to retrieve records, and we have a sample URL. And I'm going to copy this URL just so that I have it available as well. And I'm going to make a new file with it. I'm going to call it working url.txt, save it, and I'm going to reference back to it. Next, I'm going to go ahead and take another look at this API console, and I'm going to put in a beginning date and an end date. This will match up with our own application where we have a start year and end year. You can see that it requires you to have a year, a month, and date. In our case, we can just choose January 1st as always the option that we're looking for. So let's say we wanted to get articles from 2004 to 2006. So I'm going to go 2004, January 1st January 1st. And then the same thing here, January 1st of 2006. I'm going to hit try it. It's going to generate a new URL, copy that, paste it. I'm going to take a look, and I can see here that the articles have changed their publication date so that we're looking at 2005. I'm also going to copy this URL, and I'm going to paste it here as well, just so I have it all handy. All right. Now, when we study the URL that's generated, we can see a couple of things. We can see that there's a question mark that separates our parameters. There's a Q, which is then tied to our search term. And then there's an AND separated by a begin date, another AND separated by an end date. And in both situations, we have the date. So the key things to take away from here is the ANDs, the question marks, and the key letter or word that breaks down the parameters. When we work on our end of the JavaScript and jQuery, we're going to dynamically generate this URL or any URL based on the inputs that we get from users. Okay? And that's really all there is that we needed to know about how to work with the API. And now that we have this information, we can go ahead and get cracking on the JavaScript. All right, so at this point, we have successfully created an HTML layout. We've generated an API key. We found some working examples of API calls just using the URL. And now we're ready to go and get started on creating the logic that drives this application. So as a first step, as always, we need to create a link to our JavaScript and to the jQuery. So let's do that right here. So I'm going to create two different calls. One is going to be to jQuery. And then next, I'm going to have a call to the code that we have, which is called logic.js. I'm going to save it, And then in the logic.js file, I always recommend just make sure your files are talking correctly. We should hit enter, and we see test. So we know that two files are talking to each other. All right, so as I've talked to you guys before, I always recommend setting up your application with something that looks like this. A setup variable section, a functions, and sort of methods or function calls. Or sort of main process is actually what I call it, main process. And I like to divide them so it's really nice and neat. And here we go. And then let's go ahead and start thinking about all the things that our JavaScript is going to have to do. So we can get started doing this in pseudocode. So as a first element, what's going to happen in this application is we need to create JavaScript that will retrieve the user inputs. So depending on what the user puts into these sort of fields, we're going to be able to capture that and convert them into variables. So retrieve user inputs and convert to variables. Next, we're going to use those variables to run an AJAX call to the New York Times. That's going to then provide us with a JSON object that we can work with. So our step 3 will then be to say, break down the NYT object into usable fields. Once we have the usable fields, we're going to dynamically generate the content in our HTML that's going to provide us with the information. And really, that's the gist of this application. These 4 components really are the heart of the application. As we'll find, there's a 5th step that's also necessary, which is going to be in dealing with edge cases. Basically bugs or situations that are not obvious. Like maybe there's a missing field, or maybe there's something that's going to break. Something that we didn't really think was going to be the case when we first got started. So that's kind of the application that we're going to have to do. So let's get cracking on this. So when it comes to the variables that we're going to have, let's think from the top. We're going to need to have a variable that's going to hold our authorization key. In this case, it's going to hold it as a string, and it's never going to change. So let's put that right here. Next, we're going to need a variable that will hold the search term, the number of records, the start year, and the end year. And initially, these are all going to be empty. So let's put that in as well. And sometimes people like to tab things over so it all lines up. It's just a little bit of a trick. Okay? And then we're also going to need to have a variable which will hold our URL that we're generating. And because the URL is almost identical up until this point, we're going to create a variable that's just going to be called URL base. We're just changing what happens afterwards. So let's go ahead and put the URL base right now as well. So we'll call the URL base. And it's going to be basically this entire link plus plus the information associated with our authorization key. Now, when we deal with URLs, we can always move parameters around as long as they come after the question mark and there's the right number of ands. So let's say I move this over here, and then I put it in and. So the only thing I did here was I moved the API key first. And just to make sure that that still works, I'm going to go to that link and make sure that nothing broke. So we still get the record. So I know that this is a working version. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this here. Now I'm going to close off the part that doesn't include my API key, and I'm going to have it say plus API key equals plus authorization key. So this is going to create a URL that looks like this. And basically what we're going to do is add on the search term at the very end that includes this and q equals Obama stuff. You could have also included this all as one URL. So let's do that right now. And then that's our URL. Next, we need to have a article counter. And the article counter is just a way for us to say how many articles we're looking at, or what article this is, what article this is. So let's just do that as well right here. And we're going to be using this as we create for loops. So that's all we need on this front. So it looks like we've got the basic gist of what we need. The next thing that we're going to do is to register a button click, a search button click, which will run an AJAX call. So for now, let's create the function that's going to be used for the AJAX call. And we'll call this function run query. And the run query function will take two parameters. For right now, let's just say it's going to take the number of articles that we're requesting and then the query URL. To keep things simple though, let's just say that the number of articles will always be 10, but for right now, let's have both of these as arguments. So we're going to create this run query, and then inside of that, we need to create our AJAX function. So we're going to use the jQuery format of .ajax URL, query URL, and method get Now, I'm going to recommend, instead of using the function to retrieve and store everything in the response variable, I'm going to create another variable called NYT data, and that's going to store everything that's retrieved in the JSON. So let's say I retrieve this. This entire object will be stored in NYT data. Okay? So I think at this point, then let's just do a console.log of NYT data, and let's save it. So this will get us a basic AJAX call, depending on what URL we send it, as well as what number of articles we want. And at that point, we should be good to go. So let's now create an on-click event that runs this specific AJAX call. And we'll go back to our HTML, and we'll say attach sort of that on-click event to the search button. So here I've got the search button. I'm going to call it an ID equals to search button, save it, and then I'm going to create an on-click event associated with it down here. Search button, or was it BTN? It's BTN on click function, and I'm going to then have it run the query function. And like I said, this run query function is expecting two arguments, expecting a number of articles and a query URL. So in our case, we need to tell it what that query URL is. So to kind of make things easier on us, let's hard code in a value of 10, and then let's have it pass in a working URL. So let's make it pass in this entire URL and save that. Okay? So essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying run the query, give me 10 records of this URL, and this is what's going to be used inside of here. Right now, we're not even doing anything with the number of articles, but we're just including it because we've included it as an argument. Now let's run it, and let's run it right now. Let's go ahead and run it in the browser, and then let's immediately have the console open, and then we're going to hit the search button. And you can see that nothing happened. Something odd, just kind of refresh, but nothing happened. And this has to do with a small quirk associated with the fact that we're using a button type of submit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in this return false. And that's going to prevent it from going to a new page. Let's do that again. Search. Still nothing. Let's see what we did that might have triggered it. Let's first check if we're talking correctly to each other. Save it. Run it, search, test. So it just looks like our AJAX. So I took a few minutes to debug that issue and ultimately found that return false, instead of it being inside of the run query, it should have been inside of the on click event. And just a small quirk, just kind of, you know, happens to everyone. So I fixed that issue, and now that it's fixed, if I hit refresh, put in a term, doesn't really matter what I put the term in, I hit search. It's going to give me that alert pop up, and then it's going to run the query. And as you can see, the query is right here. But right now, it's just giving me all articles on Obama still, mainly because I'm still passing in a hardwired term, which is fine. We'll fix that later on. And this is kind of where we want to be. The next thing I would recommend, and I recommended this as I walked around class, is instead of just doing a console.log to show us this entire object, let's also console.log the query URL. And the big reason I'm going to recommend that is if I refresh search, I can see that the URL is right here. I can open it up in a new tab, and then I can quickly look at it in a big screen, everything that is inside of the JSON. Okay? So I now have both of these information available to me, and now I can kind of get moving on to the next step. So there's a lot of different directions we can go. We can go towards the direction of capturing the user input and making this URL dynamically. We can deal with sort of capturing different pieces of information. It's really up to you, and that's kind of why I divided you in class as a front end and as a back end team. But for what I would recommend I'm going to do is I'm going to capture the user input. So I'm going to go back to the index.html file. I'm going to go to the search term form entry, and I can see this has an ID of search, and I'm going to capture that value that's associated with it. And to do that, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to create a little snippet of code that's going to take in what's inside of that form field. So to do that, I just need to copy this code that I've got pre-written for myself, and I'm going to run it, paste it right here. So what I've done is I have a search term equal to search, the value of it, and then trim any white spaces. And if I console.log this, you'll see that we find something relevant. And let's actually take advantage of the fact that we have a query term variable up there. And instead of having this new one, I'm going to say query term, and I'm going to console.log the query term, and I'm going to run a new test on Trump, let's say. Test, you can see the query term is right here, the URL associated with the query, still on Obama, as well as the object. Let's now change it, so instead of giving us the hardwired Obama search, we're going to delete this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say var new URL equals query URL base plus, we're going to do and q equals plus the query term. I'm going to log this new URL just so we can see it. And you can see what we've got is a little bit of a mistake. Well, let's see what that could be for. I see. It's still trying to run queries. Let's comment that out for a second. Hit search, and you can see we have this new URL. Let's copy that link address, and let's take a look at it. And it didn't quite work. The Q is not showing us Trump. Let's see why that might be the case. So we have query term equals to the it's because I haven't put anything in here. Trump. I'm going to search, copy that link address, and you can see I have now an and q equals Trump. So let's now pass in the new URL into the run query function. So instead of passing in a hard valued URL, we're going to pass in new URL. So what we now have is send the Ajax call the new assembled URL, save it, rerun it. I'm going to again put Trump. I'm going to search. You can see that I have a URL for Trump, both the constructed one as well as what was passed, and then an object. So let's click on the query. And you can see here different articles all related to Donald Trump and his candidacy. Okay? So that's good. So let's continue to do this for the other form elements so that we can capture the number of records, the start year, the end year, etc. So if we go back here, we can see that we've got number of records, and we have that stored as ID of cell 1. Let's call it num records, And then we have ID of start year and end year for the other two. So let's grab those pieces of content as well. Okay, so I'm going to create a little bit of code for the start year. It's going to be start year equals to .val trim, and we're going to do the same thing for the end year, and we're going to call this end year .val.trim, and then we're going to add on these values to the end as well. So we're going to have the same new URL equals to new URL plus, and looking back at how the format should be, it should be start date or end date, or it's called begin date and end date. So let's put that in there as well. Begin date equals plus start year plus end date equals plus end year. Now this is close to where we need to go, but there's one thing to keep in mind. Right now we're having users put in a year, but the working example actually required us to put in the year and the month and the day. So we're actually going to have to add on a little bit to the end of this just to make sure it works. So we're going to grab the start year information plus 0101 to the end, which is just going to be related to January 1st, 0101. Let's save it. And then again, let's console.log the new URL with the date information. Okay, let's rerun this page. We're going to do Trump 2001, 2002, search, inspect it. And you can see here we've got this new URL. I'm going to go to it. And it looks like we've got new articles on Trump. This one about Trump Place from 2001. So we have a working edition. Now, as you can see, we've made these parameters to be optional. So what we want to do is instead of having it always added, we want to create situations where only add these values in if they actually have information. So in our case, we're going to parse that value. And if it truly is a number, if there's actually content in there, then add the begin date information. Okay. Similarly, if there is an end date, only then should we be adding in the information associated with the end date. Okay. So let's run this again. This time we'll see what happens when we put no parameters. Looks like we got a little bit of an issue, it seems like. Seems like something is still tracking. I see the issue. It does look like one of the issues is because we have this 0101 at the end, parse int is actually a number. So we're going to have to do this step after we've checked to see if the user input existed or not. So here we're going to say start year equals start year plus 0101. And then here we're going to have to do end year equals end year plus 0101. So really small thing, tons of bugs. This is as I said, pretty complicated application. it's sometimes tough to keep in mind all the things that are going on. Okay. So rerun it again. This time we should see a success. So let's put in Trump. So we have URLs with no dates. Now let's put in a date of start year of 2001. We have a 2001 URL with working content. Now let's put in a end year of 2002. And we've got a end date of 2002. Let's try putting in both. And we have start date and end date. And all of these URLs work. Now I know what some of you might be thinking, well, we've handled the date, we've handled the search term, but how do we handle the number of records to retrieve? This is specifically kind of tough because when we go back to the NYT API console, you might remember that there was no spot to put in the number of records. It actually is not in any way a method or sort of a parameter. What this means is that if we want to filter this, we can't do it from the API side. We're actually going to have to create some for loops that's going to limit the number of records that we retrieve. So while we're always going to get this many records, we're only going to show users 1 or 5 or 10 articles as opposed to every single one of these. So what we're going to do here is we're going to track the number of number of records, and we're just going to create another item to grab that. We're going to say num article num results equals to num records val. And the reason we have to we don't have to use a dot trim in this situation is because it's a select box. We already know what the values are. They're always hard coded in. So we're able to get the number of records, and what we're going to use with this number of results variable is we're going to pass it into our run query function. So instead of passing in this hard-coded 10, we're going to pass in num results. And combined now, we're going to both use the new URL and the number of results to sort of create the data set that we want to create. So we've made a huge amount of progress now that we can see working data inside of our console. So now that we have a working version of the application sort of in retrieving data working in the console, our next step is to expand on the run query function so that we're able to grab the relevant pieces of data that we need to continue to fuel the application. One thing that I noticed as I was looking at the code, I was missing a $sign right here, so I'm going to add that in. And the other thing we need to change is the run query function should now take in the new num results. Let's also take the moment to clean up some of the extra console.logs, because if you run the application right now, some of the extra console logs come in. We've got a bunch of URLs. It might get a little confusing, so let's just clean this up a little bit. And then we're going to rely only on these two console.logs to give us the URL. So if we rerun it, we do Obama, search with the URL, the object. Let's also log the number of articles requested. Save it, rerun it. So we've got Obama's link 5 and then the object, switch it up. We can do Trump 1 URL number of articles. So we've got the basic structure that we need. Now what we need to do is to create some content that's going to retrieve the data from the URL. And as I said, it's always helpful to have the URL open in another tab just to figure out what it is that we're grabbing. So inside of our done Ajax function, we need to retrieve, in our case, the author, the title, section, data, and link. And these aren't named the exact same, so it's a little bit tricky to figure out what's what. But essentially what we need to track is the URL here, the headline, the main headline, the byline, which is the author, somewhere in here as well. We're going to have to dig around and find it. And as well as the publication date, which is right here. And let's see if there's anything else that we're missing. And the section. So let's see if we can find section. Section name right there. And byline is here. In this case, it was empty. So that always makes things confusing. But maybe here's another byline, but this one has a person's name. Okay, or in this case, we'll take the original. So there's different pieces of information. Feel free to kind of dig in on your own time, but we're going to go ahead and get just started off of what we have. So inside of this console.log, this done function, I'm going to console.log a couple of pieces of information. Now, as we remember, we've said that the entire object is called NYT data, which means that if we were trying to, let's say, grab the main headline, we would need to write NYT data dot response, which correlates with this object, dot docs. And because docs is actually an array and not an object, let's say we would grab the very first one, dot headline main. Okay, let's take a look and see if we get this one worked. Let's run it. Let's say Trump search. We've got Ted Cruz keeps up pressure on Donald Trump, and that's the headline. Now, if we wanted to log, let's say, 10 different headlines, the way we'd have to do that is to take the number of articles and loop through each of the docs that was in here. So we have to create a for loop. So here we're going to do for int var I equals 0, I is less than NYT data dot response dot docs I dot docs dot length. So essentially, give me less than the length of all the documents retrieved, and then I'm going to say I++, and we're going to say console.log I. So what we should see here is each of the 10 articles that have the title of Trump. So you see, these are the 10 articles that came up. Similarly, if we put in Obama, we would get, there are multiples of this Obama in their own words, but we'd see these are the articles associated with Obama. Now, let's go ahead and kind of put some labels around this stuff just to make it easy. Headline. And let's do the same for the other fields that matter. In our case, we're looking at section well, maybe we shouldn't have all these lines, might get kind of confusing. But let's just put in the context without worrying about the divisions. Console.log NYT data dot response dot docs I dot, let's see where section is, section name, NY region. So we're going to do, let's make sure it's not a sub. Perfect. So we're going to do dot section name, and then we're going to log NYT data dot response dot docs I dot, let's see what else we're tracking, date, which is pub date right here. And then we need to log the URL. So let's see if we can find that. Web URL. All right, so we've got a lot of information. Let's try and run it. Trump, go 10 times, search, and let's see if we've got all the information. So we've got a title, a section, the publication date, and the URL. Now let's add on the author, which is found in the byline. So let's do that. Console.log NYT data .response .docs I .byline .original. Let's run it, and let's do again Trump. So it looks like we've got these author information as well. And it looks like we've got everything we need to move on to the next step, which is to grab and sort of display this content. But let's take a moment to take stock of what we've been able to do. We've now taken JSON information, we're looping through and grabbing all the pieces of information that we want selectively from this JSON. Now, if we wanted to do the filtering, so instead of doing all 10, we get 5 or 1, we would actually take advantage of this num articles. And what we're going to do is only loop through the length of num articles. So we're going to loop through it only the number of times that we requested. So if we only requested one, let's search. We only have one of these. If we try running it 5 times, we'll see that we've got 5 articles. Now, one thing you may have astutely noticed if you were paying attention is when I did trump and I only looked at one, I actually got this undefined. And this is going to be really sort of a headache to deal with. And that comes into play when we're missing a byline information or an author information on an article. And it really can screw things up because this will be considered a bug. So let's just leave it as is for right now, but just pay attention to it. So with this information in play, we're now able to extract information. Our next step is to take the information that's being logged and to dynamically create wells that are going to appear here. All right, guys, I hope you're hanging in there. We're almost done with this application. So last we stopped, we kind of got to a point where we were able to log different pieces of information inside of console that related to a specific search. We now need to take those values and then dump them into wells in our search results. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually clear out the dummy wells that I had. And I'm going to go ahead and delete these so that I have an empty panel. And the reason I deleted them is I'm going to have jQuery create the wells for me dynamically. So let's do that right now. Step 1 of this is to have a unique identifier for my panel. So we'll call this ID equals to well section. And the reason it's called well section is because we're going to put in a bunch of wells inside of here. Now, inside of the run query function, we're going to sort of create the HTML that will dump this content into place. So let's do that right here. We're going to have start dumping to HTML here. And we're going to create a var called well section equal to a jQuery div. And then we're going to attach that well section to a class called well. And the reason we're calling it well is because that correlates with the Bootstrap well class and will give us sort of the unique things we need. Then the next thing that's very important is for us to make sure that we give these wells each a unique ID. And the reason we're giving it a unique ID is because we want it to match up with the number of each article to have a unique ID associated with it, so that that well is associated with article number 1 or article number 2, etc. So let's say we put in article well, and we'll call it article well plus I. So the first one will be article well number 0, etc., etc. And I think at this point, that's kind of the initial part. Next, we need to sort of grab our well section, and we're going to append this variable well section. So we took the HTML well section, and then we added the jQuery one. Now we need to sort of add in the content to the appropriate well. So let's do this here as well. Attach the content to the appropriate well. And we're going to do, for instance, in this case, is we're going to say well section dash plus I dot append, and we're going to have a set of text, but let's just initially not deal with headers and sort of whatnot. We're going to put in this like so. So here what we're saying is, as we sort of loop through, each well is going to have a new name, and it's going to be called article well 0, article well 1, etc., etc. And then we're going to refer back to the article wells that we're creating and append the HTML content. So in this case, let's say we append in h3, and we're going to do this here as well. And we're now going to run it and see if this works. Let's see. Search. So we were able to create 5 wells, so that's a step in the right direction. Let's see then if we were able to append anything. So something is still a little bit off. Let's try to figure out if what we think these IDs are actually what the IDs are. And we can already see that kind of where one of the issue is. So we're creating these wells. If I go into the elements section and I dig in to the row, dig into the column, dig into this panel default, I can see that I've created wells, and each of the wells have a name of article well 0, article well 1, etc., etc. But when I attach it, I've been attaching to the wrong thing. So instead, I should be attaching it to article well plus I. Let's try it now. Search. So very close, but you can see that we've now printed the hard content, which is not what we want. What we actually want is to print NYT data as a variable, and outside of that to have the H3 tags. This will make it a header. So let's try it one more time. Boom. We now have 5 different articles for each of the Barack Obama articles. Next, let's continue this. Let me hide this mini map so it gets out of the way. Next, let's do the same thing, this time for another piece of content. Let's do it this time for H2 plus, and we'll grab the section name. And because this is a little bit less important, let's call these H5s. Save it, rerun it. Again, we'll do Obama, we'll search. You can see that we have the opinion, the universal, US, books, etc. We're making good progress. All right, we're going to do this a couple more times for the publication date, the byline, and the web URL. So let's copy this text, this little bit of code. Boom, boom, boom. And we're going to change out the information to match what we need. So in this case, we're going to take this pub date, dump it here, byline original, dump it here, and take the web URL and dump it here. Save it, refresh, and let's see what we get. Obama 5. There you go. You can see nearly completed New York Times article search. So titles, section, publication date, author, URL. Now, one other thing we want to fix is this URL. Let's, instead of making it an H5, let's make it an actual link. So we'll say A, and we'll say ahref equals plus NYT web URL plus NYT. So essentially what I'm saying is take the href, make it equal to that variable, and then put the text inside with the link. So if I refresh it again, we'll do 10 this time, search for it. Oh, a little bit of mistake. Let's see what we made wrong with this one. So I made a little bit of mistake with the URL. Let's see where our plus sign might be missing. Here's one. All right, Obama 10, search, and you can see we've got all the articles that we're looking for. Now, at this point, the application kind of works nearly completed. I mean, essentially, we can run other search terms, we can put in different dates, and it looks like this case it didn't work, right? Something almost threw it off. Let's try it again. Trump 10. 2010, 2011, search. So we've got all the articles associated with Donald Trump. Now, as you could see when I tried to rerun the code, something came out a little bit off. And that is that content sort of dumped inside of each other. And this has to do with the fact that we're never clearing out our well titles as we sort of move to the next search. But this, along with another issue that we're facing, is one in which we have a couple of situations where content may be missing. Like maybe we're missing the author. A notable example is if you search for Bush, you get uncaught, cannot read property original of null. And this has to do with this byline.original. So even though our application is nearly working, we still have a few bugs to deal with. And so this is going to be our final phase of the development process, we're going to deal with sort of edge cases or the bugs that inevitably come up when you're creating an application. All right, let's move on to the next phase. All right, so last we left off, you've got the application more or less working. We're able to see different articles pop up, but there are weird situations with bugs, or as another example, content is piling up on top of each other. So different bugs need to be resolved. And the second of these two is probably the easier of the two. And that has to do with content being piling up on top of each other. So this has to do with the fact that each time we run a search, we're never getting rid of the fact that we have wells that already exist. So whenever we do this append code, it's just going to add it to the bottom of the well. So to get around this, we need to make sure that at the very start, we run some code that clears out our well section. So here we've got this well section ID, and we're going to go ahead and put inside of here section.empty. And that's going to clear the wells from the previous run. Save it, rerun it. We're going to hit Obama 10 search. And it looks like we might have just broken something. Let's see what we did. So empty is spelled wrong. Let's fix that. Empty, save it. Okay, we're going to do Obama, search for 5, switch it up to Trump, search for 5, and still not quite what we need. Let's see if we, still spelled well section wrong. Switch that up. Obama, search for 5, Trump, search for 5. So we've switched it out, and now there's no overlap. So that's a huge next success. Now, situations still come up, though. Let's take a look at this example, for instance. Let me look at Bush for 5, and you can see only 2 articles popped up. And if we look into the console, we can kind of see why that's the case. It has to do with the fact that original of null does not exist. And the word original shows up here when we use the byline. Now, it's kind of hard to understand why this issue is taking place without looking at the URL. So let's figure out the URL that we're grabbing. Let's look at the console.log of the URL. Here's our console.log. Let's put this, make it easy for ourselves to find it. Okay, let's save it, rerun it. That way we can look up Bush, search it, and we can see, this code isn't even being run because it falls below the error. So let's put it up very top. Save it, rerun it. Bush, search. So this is the URL. I'm going to go into it, and what you'll find is there are many situations in which the byline doesn't actually have anything. It's just a null. There's no original inside. So the fix for this is to make sure that we only include the text inside of here if the byline has information. So it's going to have a series of if statements that are not going to run any of this stuff or this stuff if the byline doesn't exist. So don't worry if the code seems a little bit confusing. The key takeaway from this is if something is missing, then we're not going to include anything. So what I'm going to do to resolve the issue of sort of the missing fields and creating the conditionals is I'm going to create a series of conditionals that will track headline and section name and just make sure that they exist in the way that we expect. So here I'm going to put NYT data.response.docs.i.headline. If it's not equal to null, then and only then should we run this code. And also, then and only then should we append it to the HTML. Now it's important, check if things exist, that this conditionals exist after we've created the HTML. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to append anything. So I'm going to do the same thing for the byline issue, just changing up the text a little bit. And I'm going to do NYT data.response.docs.i.byline and NYT data.response.docs.i.byline.original. Let's say byline.has own property by original. So basically we're saying if the byline actually has a property of original and the byline actually exists, then and only then should we run the code associated with the byline. Now, I've run this code a couple of times, so I know that the other properties, sort of the URL, the section, and publication date, they always exist. So it's not that big of a deal if you don't have conditionals for them. But in an ideal world, you would put the conditionals just in case. But with this, we should be able to get a working version. So let's say we do Bush for 5. So we have 5 different articles that popped up. And in situations where we have the missing field, we just have null. And you could later on go back and make sure that it displays something. But this deals with the issue that we were originally facing. Okay, so it looks like we've got a working application at this point. It took us well over an hour, well over an hour, but hopefully, you know, the fruits of this labor was worth it. In my opinion, this application really is sort of presents a high point for where you are in the class. If you were able to follow along, if you were able to do it yourself, it really does show a degree of mastery both of front end, back end, use of APIs, changing content dynamically, all of which make you very competitive for many careers. So I hope this video was helpful. I'm going to tune out, and I'll see you guys in class next week. All right, take care.